Hi guys, my name is Amish Tripathi and I'm the director of the Nehru Centre. The Nehru Centre is the cultural wing of the Indian High Commission in the UK, and we've been in existence for many decades, and we organize wonderful events at this very auditorium, which is in Mayfair in central London. Sadly, as you can see, the auditorium is empty. It has been empty since we were all put into lockdown due to the coronavirus pandemic. But what we Indians believe is that the other side of a crisis is an opportunity. And what we have done at the Nehru Centre is moved all our events online. So now if you attend our online events, every single seat is a VIP seat. Like you get a front row at our events. No trouble of parking, no trouble of traveling all the way. And practically all the programs that we would do, like literary discussions and dance performances, musical performances. We are doing them all on our online channels. You can register for our newsletter at our website nehrucentre.org.uk. You don't need to write them down. They will be displayed at the bottom of the screen. You can also come to our Facebook page, which is a verified page, the Nehru Centre. You can follow updates on all our events on Twitter as well, the Nehru Centre. That's also a verified account. Or you can come to our YouTube channel. Again, the Nehru Centre. We are nothing if not consistent. I hope you do come to our online channels and enjoy the events that we're putting up for you. Thank you so much for all your love and support. Namaste. Jai Hind.
Namaste, my name is Amish Tripathi. I'm the director of the Nehru Centre, and this is a day of immense pride for us. The Nehru Centre is hosting the global online launch event of one of India's most loved authors, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. His latest book, Tharoorosaurus, and we will be, of course, introducing Dr. Tharoor shortly. He's waiting backstage, if he can be brought up. And Namaste, Dr. Tharoor. How are you, sir?
Namaste to you. How are you? How are you, Navesh?
Wonderful. I'm well. I'll be introducing you shortly formally. But I thought before that, how about if we have a reveal of the book that we are to launch today?
That was well done. Thank you. Your book is officially launched now.
Exactly. The problem with doing things online, right? So we got to replicate the stuff, the ripping apart of the wrapping paper. Yeah, and but at least we did a bit of that. You get a feel of a launch.
I'm delighted, and unlike that, you don't have the problem of struggling with too much of Scotch tape on the wrapping paper, which too many of us have had to deal with. Well done.
There you go. Before we get into the conversation, if I may do the formalities, if I could introduce Dr. Tharoor formally to all of you. Not that he needs it, but one must do formalities. Dr. Shashi Tharoor is the best-selling author of 20 books, both fiction and non-fiction. Besides being a noted critic and columnist, his books include the path-breaking satire, the great Indian novel, one of my favorites. I read when I was in college. The classic India from Midnight to the Millennium, the best-selling An Era of Darkness, the British Empire in India, for which he won the Ramnath Goenka Award for Excellence in Journalism, and The Paradoxical Prime Minister. He has been Under Secretary General of the United Nations and Minister of State for Human Resource Development and Minister of State for External Affairs in the Government of India. He's a three-time member of the Lok Sabha from Thiruvananthapuram and chairs the Parliament Information Technology Committee. He has won numerous literary prizes, including a National Sahitya Academy Award, a Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and Crossword Lifetime Achievement Award. You're too young to win a Lifetime Achievement Award.
So that's what I like to tell them, but I'm afraid my birth certificate proves otherwise.
He was awarded the Prabhasi Bharatiya Samman, India's highest honor for overseas Indians in 2004, and honored as New Age Politician of the Year in 2010 by NDTV. A CV that most people would die for. Fantastic honor for us, Dr. Tharoor. Thank you so much for gracing us with your presence.
It's such a pleasure to be with you, Amish. I've done a lot of physical events at the Nehru Centre. This is my first virtual event with you, and I'm looking forward to more.
Thank you so much. So let's jump in straight into the conversation. Tharoorosaurus. The first question that came in my mind, and I'm sure comes in the mind of most people, how the hell did Meru Gokhale convince you of this? And you are such a sport for doing this. Meru Gokhale, for those who don't know, is the editor of Penguin Random House, a very mischievous woman, and she managed to convince Dr. Tharoor to launch this. Tell us the story.
Well, I've been a bit bemused by the reputation I've acquired in our country for wielding difficult words, especially because most of the time I wasn't doing so deliberately or for effect. I happened to know the words in question. I thought they were the most apposite for the thought I was seeking to convey. But at one point, when I lost my temper with a really nasty, unpleasant journalist who had made up a whole lot of lies about me, I lashed out in a tweet saying, a farrago of misrepresentations, distortions, and outright lies. And suddenly, apparently, there was a huge spike in searches for the word farrago on the Oxford English Dictionary site. They themselves tweeted that there was a million people looked up farrago on the OED, mainly from India, and they didn't know why. So that suddenly gave me this reputation, and people started calling me Mr. Farrago and so on. And it became then I thought, you may as well turn the negative label into a positive one. So I started using it as a joke. I used it, for example, when I was launching the book you mentioned, The Paradoxical Prime Minister. I deliberately tweeted, this book is more than a 500-page exercise in floxy-nosy-nihilipilification, which is a made-up word from the 19th century that means the act of estimating something or someone as worthless. So by using that word, I obviously got far more attention for the launch of the book than just saying I've written a new book would have got me. That kind of thing then came into it. And then I started seeing other mischievous uses. For example, using an obscure word to illustrate a particular point in the news cycle. There was a time when a particular chief minister who had been elected as an ally of the Congress party, my party, defected to the opposite side. And at that point, I tweeted, without mentioning him or the incident anyway, I just tweeted the word snollygoster, 1845 US slang, a shrewd, unprincipled politician. Original usage 1845, latest usage today. And that tweet, obviously people understood who I was referring to and it became very popular. And snollygoster also got a spike lookup on the Oxford English Dictionary. So I think ultimately Meru Gokhale was actually leaping onto the fact that that this reputation, which I had been involuntarily saddled with, because farrago was a word I'd used in college debates at St. Stephen's in Delhi almost 50 years ago. And then I'd used it in articles, I'd used it in books 20 years ago. Suddenly to find that people hadn't noticed was a sobering realization that our vocabulary perhaps has been shrinking in modern India. But anyway, she said, why don't we write this? And she came up with the idea of Tharoorosaurus, a title that would combine my name with the words Tyrannosaurus, and so many are terrified of difficult words, and thesaurus, and so many people want to look them up. And I laughed it off initially and said, yeah. But then she persisted, and I began to think it might be fun to do after all. And the result is this book that you've just launched, Amish.
What a story. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. In between all these questions, I'm going to pick up some of the words that I thought you could speak on, and then we could come back to the conversation. So a word that I thought we should use, just to have some fun with Meru Gokhale, since he's from Penguin Random House. So very obviously, why don't we discuss juggernaut?
That is naughty of you, Emil. We won't explain why, so that people, the people who are in the know will understand why you think juggernaut is a different word. I wanted to write about it because so many people, particularly non-Indians, reading the word in an English sentence assume it's of German origin. It looks like it, Juggernaut. For example, the Junkers in Germany, juggernaut or something like that, they must think. but it's actually a mangling of Juggernaut, the name of the great deity carried in devotional procession in Odisha 4 times a year. And everyone knows about the Rath Yatra and so on, when the idol is wheeled to the Puri Jagannath temple in an enormous chariot as devotees line the streets, often in a frenzy, hailing the Lord with chants and prayers and so on. Now, what happened was that way back in the 14th century, way before British colonialism, there was a travelogue written by a guy called Sir John Mandeville. And he apparently was himself basing himself on a 13th century French Franciscan monk called Odoric of Pardenon. Now, these guys, they popularized the idea of Hindus throwing themselves under the wheels of the enormous Jagannath chariots as a religious sacrifice and being crushed to death. Now, the tale is obviously false, because that's not it. Jagannath is a very forgiving and loving God, and people have no such concept of human sacrifice. But because Odoric and the eponymous Sir John Mandeville's travels, if they actually ever saw a Hindu being killed under the wheels of a chariot, it can only be because some poor devotee stumbled or was pushed by the throng and fell accidentally. But and of course, the enormous chariot could not easily stop or turn on the narrow road. But having popularized the story, people began using it as a synonym for an irresistible, destructive force that demands total devotion or unforgiving sacrifice. And in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, novels by Charlotte Bronte and Charles Dickens, even Robert Louis Stevenson talked about, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Mr. Hyde was the evil guy. He apparently conducted himself like a juggernaut, this kind of thing. So juggernaut became a symbol for remorseless, implacable, a merciless, destructive, and unstoppable force that demands blind devotion or absolute sacrifice. And sort of like a steamroller or a battering ram. And so you hear it today in words like, the Chinese economic juggernaut, or the Obama electoral juggernaut, which of course Biden is hoping to come back with, who can stop the Federer juggernaut at Wimbledon, that kind of thing. So that's the kind of usage that you see very commonly today. But I think it's important for people to understand it's actually a mangling of a Hindu god. It's no reflection of Indian reality. It's a product really of the British and American imagination. When I say American, it should be said that Mark Twain, in his autobiography, because he traveled to India in the 1880s, he described Jagannath as the kindest of gods. And we all know that Jagannath is a figure of reverence, not of fear. But the damage, alas, has been done, and Jagannath has passed unstoppably, yes, into the English language.
Oh, sadly true. I mean, another example of colonial defamation, which has sadly...
In this case, pre-colonial. It's Orientalism before the colonials, yeah.
Yeah, man. I mean, I've lived in Odisha, and Jagannath Ji, I mean, the Rath Yatra is one of the finest sights to behold, honestly. I mean, it's unfortunate. But yes, It is a word that has sewn itself into English.
You're right.
Yeah. What got you so interested into the words themselves? In the traditional Indian way, there is the Valmiki school, there's the Ved Vyas school. They're the gods among Indian writers, and they're of course great rishis. But the Valmiki school, much more poetic, much more in love with the language itself. So many of the turns of phrase of Valmiki Ji were used even by Kalidasa Ji, many centuries later. Whereas the Ved Vyas Ji school is much more efficient, much more focused on conveying the story, philosophies.
Philosophies in particular.
Yeah. What school are you in? And kind of obvious question. And what got you into it?
Well, I'll tell you first what got me into it before I answer such a demanding question as what school I belong to. I'm not a trained linguist or philologist. The book is not a scholarly work. It's actually the work of someone who loves words and has loved them all his life, and whose cherished childhood memories revolve around word games with a father who was even more obsessed with them than I am. My father, Dr Tharoor, was everything to me: a teacher, guide, research advisor, imparter of values, my source of faith, energy, and self-belief. And of course, my enthusiasm for life and appetite for learning are inherited from him. So is my workaholism and my love of words. So my dad was a Scrabble addict, and he played every word game that had ever been invented, including Boggle, the acrostics in newspapers. He would play games with my sisters and me, and my sisters, one of them is a regular attendee of the Nehru Centre, so she might even be listening now, where we would try to see how many words of 4 letters or more we could make from letters in a 9 or 10 letter word that he would give us. He invented word games for family car journeys when one of the passengers had to imagine a 5-letter word and the others had to guess it within 20 attempts by trying out 5-letter words and being told how many letters matched with the secret word. So his fascination for words had to rub off on me, but it was never words just for their own sake. My father instilled in me the conviction that words are what shape ideas and reflect thought. And the more words you know, the more precisely and effectively you're able to express your thoughts and ideas. And so for me, I kind of collected words the way another kid might have collected stamps, but not by looking up a dictionary. I did it just by reading. I read as widely as possible. And when you see the same word being used in multiple contexts, you start to get an idea of its meaning through the way it's situated in the text. And of course, it helped that I grew up as a kid in India without television, without Nintendo, computers, mobile phones, PlayStation, any of the distractions that today's young have to have competing for their attention other than books. So books were my escape, they were my entertainment, they were my education.
Fortunately, PUBG has been removed also as an option now.
As an MP, Amish, I'm getting a lot of complaints.
Sorry. Coming back.
But coming back to this, so I used in this book words I used in a tweet like farrago or caucastocracy, or words that the country was suddenly using a lot more than usual, like pandemic and quarantine, or words in the news like impeachment when Trump was impeached, or apostrophe, or sometimes just words that I could tell interesting stories about, like defenestrate or curfew. So the words are quite a mix, but the idea is also to give a fairly eclectic and wide-ranging mix of words to essentially get readers hooked onto the pleasure of words that I've always enjoyed. Now about Valmiki and Ved Vyas, you told me when we first met that you had read and enjoyed my book, The Great Indian Novel, which was a satirical reinvention of the Mahabharata. So since I put myself in the position of a modern-day Ved Vyas, I should probably go there. But you yourself also feel that I've focused as much on the telling of the tale, the style used in telling the tale, as I have in the tale itself. And that's where the Valmiki bit comes in. I have to confess that if I have to lean between the two, because I ideally would like to combine both, efficiently conveying your ideas and doing so in a style that's a pleasure for itself. So I'd like to combine both Valmiki and Ved Vyas, but if I have to lean towards one, it would probably be Valmiki, because to my mind, one of those great stories, of Valmiki writing the Ramayana, and then Hanuman telling him, oh, I've written the Ramayana too, and Valmiki wants to see it. And he goes and reads it and he breaks down saying, you've written something so exquisitely done, so much better than anything I've written, that my Ramayana will never be read or appreciated by the world. And Hanuman destroys his text, saying, I want yours to survive. A lovely story for authors of lesser quality than the greats. But the truth is, Amish, that one would argue that if you can't, through a beautiful style, convey what you're trying to say, then the style alone is not enough.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So the time has come for another word, and a word that is very appropriate for the situation all of us are stuck in: quarantine.
Well, it's interesting because this is something which you can actually immediately guess, a period of enforced isolation. Why does it use a word that is related in many ways to a number? Because most of us know that that quarantine is somehow related to 40. Anyone who knows Italian or French will know quarante in French, quaranta in Italy. And in fact, it actually started in Italy. And the expression used was quarantina giorni, which means a space of 40 days. Quaranta is 40, giorni is days, and it was a Venetian policy going way back to the days of the Big Plague, 1377, when they kept ships from plague-stricken countries waiting off the port of Venice for 40 days, just to assure themselves that no communicable cases were aboard the ships. So, because no effective treatment or cure was known at that time. And then, inevitably, any period of forced isolation became associated with the same word. It didn't have to be 40 days. And as we know, these days, quarantine does not refer to a specific period of days, but just that isolation in which you are kept away from others. In fact, in English, the word quarantine even had an earlier meaning because, for example, in the past when widows had to leave their husband's home, they had the right to remain in their dead husband's home for 40 days. This is in the early 16th century. Then there was quarantine in the religious sense. When Christ fasted for 40 days, he was said to be in quarantine. And Moses spent 40 days on Mount Sinai. That was quarantine. The Catholic observation of Lent is 40 days of spiritual purification. But obviously today, all of those connotations have long since been forgotten, and they're essentially about isolating people so they can't infect others. So essentially, in quarantining people, and even before the pandemic era, you had a policy, for example, in many countries, if you want to move from another country with an animal, a dog or a cat or whatever, that pet has to be quarantined for a period of time before the new country will allow it to come in case it's bringing any diseases with it. So that's the background and story of quarantine.
Very, very, very interesting. Do you think languages have a core culture? It's like, classical Sanskrit, the version of Sanskrit that's alive till today, which is essentially what emerged from Panini, from the great sage Panini's Ashadhyay, which made Sanskrit very organized, in some ways rigid, but also very scientific, phonetic, as compared to English, which is very flexible. I wonder if you've read Melvin Bragg's The Adventure of English.
To be embarrassingly honest, I have not. Should I?
Okay.
Or is it too late? Have I already
You're a big part of that adventure.
So we'll get Melvin Bragg to write a sequel or an epilogue to add me.
It's a tome. I read a long time back. I remember it was 700, 800 pages. And he said that the strength of English, if I'm paraphrasing, I will not use the word that he used, but essentially the strength of English was its need to just be so flexible that you'd really have no rules, right? And that it adapted so easily to other things as compared to Sanskrit, and which is where I'm coming to in my question, that there was classical Sanskrit and there were the Prakrut languages, which later became Apabhramasha. So the Prakrut languages were flexible. They would adapt with the times. They would be open to passionate reinterpretation, whereas classical Sanskrit would remain phonetic, proper. And someone studying classical Sanskrit today could read a text 2000 years ago and it would be structured exactly the same. English today tries to be both. It tries to be flexible as well, tries to have some of the classical qualities as well. How does that work out then for English?
Well, I must say that Sanskrit, frankly, was its own worst enemy, because the Brahmins of that era confined Sanskrit to a very narrow elite. Yes, it was a sophisticated, rigorous language, very clear rules of grammar, very extensive and expansive sense of concepts and vocabulary, including particularly philosophical vocabulary. But since only the narrow segment of Indian society, that was the Brahmin segment, was able to read it, use it, and employ it, in fact, it was actually a punishable offense for others. A Prakrit or local Prakrits in the plural had to evolve so people could communicate with each other who weren't allowed to use Sanskrit. I think Sanskrit would never have died out had the Brahmins of that era been more democratically minded. Equally, Sanskrit has infused itself into multiple languages. So, for example, I am constantly discovering how many affinities there are between the words in Malayalam, which is known to be a Dravidic language, but which has a very strong vocabulary component derived from Sanskrit, and similar words from the same Sanskritic root in Hindi. So, in fact, the cultural unity of India through Sanskrit is evident from language. Now, English, as you say rightly, is incredibly flexible. It has been so adaptable that it's taken in words from various languages. There are about 1,000 words in the Oxford English Dictionary of Indian origin. And of course, there are words even from Sanskrit. And in fact, I have one of them in Tharoorosaurus, which is a word that Mahatma Gandhi came up with, satyagraha, which actually comes from two Sanskrit compounds, satya meaning truth, and agraha, which actually comes from the root that implies holding firmly onto something. So satyagraha was about holding firmly onto truth. And what I liked about that was that not only was it an application of Sanskrit to contemporary English, but it came up as a result of a public campaign, sort of a Wikipedia equivalent in 1906 in South Africa, when Mahatma Gandhi asked for a word because he didn't like the English term passive resistance to connote the civil disobedience campaign that he was conducting against the racist South African laws and policies of that time. He felt that he wanted something that would actually convey activism, not passivity. So what is all this passive resistance? And so Satya Agraha, holding on to truth, that appealed to Gandhi because he said if you believed in truth and cared enough to obtain it, you could not afford to be passive. You had to be prepared actively to suffer for truth. Now, you can give Sanskrit the credit for coming up with both these words, and you can give English the credit for being able to absorb it into contemporary casual English usage, so that, especially during the nationalist movement, it was very common currency, and most English speakers, even in the English newspapers, English readers would come across that word. So that, I think, is the answer to your question, Amish.
Interesting. So time for a word again. I'm not sure how to pronounce this. Zugzwang. It just sounds so bizarre.
Well, it's actually a term that is actually, unlike juggernaut, it actually is of German origin because it comes from two German roots. Zug apparently means move and Zwang means compulsion. I don't know German, so I'll have to take the word of my sources for it. But what Zugzwang together means, being forced to make a move, and it's a term in chess. I believe it's also been occasionally applied to other board games, in which the player finds himself at a disadvantage because he's forced to make a move that will actually be negative for him, that will have adverse consequences for his position in the game. So where the rules of the game, as in chess, do not permit you simply to pass. I mean, even in Scrabble, my dad's favorite game, you can actually skip a turn if you're waiting for the right opportunity on the board. But in chess, you can't, right? You have to play. And if your opponent maneuvers into a position of Zugzwang, it means that if you play, you're basically sort of toast. And that essentially means that if you put somebody in Zugzwang, the person being compelled to move means that their move will create a significantly weaker position for them in the game. Any possible move in Zugzwang will make your position, your situation worse. But you have no choice. You have to do it, even if it leads to certain defeat. And that is something which is an extraordinary idea from chess that one can apply to so many situations in contemporary life. Even though my book is largely non-political, the examples I use are about a couple of political episodes. In state politics in India, when state governments were forced to take a step that resulted in their collapse. So it's actually a very useful metaphorical usage, and I'm glad to have known a little bit enough about chess to have known about it.
I think coming back to English again, a language that you know so well. Someone who speaks to his parents in one of the Indian languages, right? In the Malayalam, we're used to languages being phonetic, right? So the very concept of a spelling contest makes no sense, because why would a word be spelled differently from how it's pronounced? It's the very concept is illogical in Hindi or any of the phonetic, more scientific languages. Why is it that English has, and for your research, your philosophical understanding, why is it that English has such illogical spellings? I mean, you can have LIT and then you add GH to it, it changes the spelling of the pronunciation of I. I mean, what sense does that make? And how
I know.
does
In
someone
fact,
who hasn't grown up in English, how does he even make sense of this?
not by that kind of study. You really do have to live it, hear it, read it, watch movies and TV shows and pick up the language that way, because there's no way that just by reading. In fact, George Bernard Shaw, the Irish writer, playwright, novelist, who actually wrote some magnificent English but never considered himself English. He always used to say he's Irish. George Bernard Shaw said, "What is GHOTI? Can you pronounce it?" And somebody said, "Well, as in laugh is F, O as in women is I, TI as in motion is SH. So I was spelling fish for you in English." So goti is a spelling for fish. Now, I mean, obviously it's a joke, but the point is that that is part of the absurdity of English. I'm told that the reasons are too numerous. They vary enormously. In most cases, they have to do with the origins of the word. Some words have come to English through Anglo-Saxon roots, Germanic, Nordic languages. Some have come from the Vikings. Some have come from French, particularly after Norman invasions. But this is not today's French, it's old French. There was a time, for example, when the English language used accents as the French do, and then they dropped the accents for the most part. There are very few words. Cliché is one of them, where you are still supposed to use an accent on the final E. But otherwise, most words are risque. But otherwise, most of the time, the English don't bother with accents. What happens, however, is that the origins bring with them their own rules and conventions. Sometimes, by the way, it can simply be a mistake. For example, the lovely fruit, the orange. You know why an orange is called an orange in English? Because the English discovered the oranges from the Arabs. And the Arabs called it a narang. Or something like that. I don't know Arabic either, but I've read that. And so when they would say, "Can you give me a narang?" It became an arang, and then the mistake was made, and the N got separated from the rest of the word, and so it became, instead of a norange, which was the English pronunciation of narang, a norange became an orange, and then orange became the word. A similar thing I've described in the book for the word umpire, because the word umpire similarly comes from an ancient root referring to naumpa, which was a kind of referee or a disinterested judge, and a naumpa became an umpire. So words can have all sorts of origins, including mistaken ones.
Fascinating. And since we're speaking of spellings and pronunciations and the impact that actually the correct usage of letters and symbols can have, can you tell us about apostrophe? I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, that was actually a lot of fun to write, because, I wrote about it soon after seeing the news that after 18 years of existence, the British Apostrophe Protection Society had been disbanded. Now, who would have known there was a British Apostrophe Protection Society? But it was founded by a retired journalist called John Richards, because he was sick of the misuse of the apostrophe. And then he disbanded the society because he said the ignorance and laziness present in modern times have won. And so he said that despite his best efforts, he's lost the battle for proper usage of this much abused apostrophe, and he gave it up. Now, when I started looking into the word apostrophe, by the way, there are some people even today in England who would argue that just as English dropped the accents it got from French, it should also drop the apostrophe. And that's something we can discuss in a minute. But when I started looking up apostrophe, I discovered that there were actually a couple of other meanings that have fallen out of use. For example, it came from Latin and Greek in the theater, where apostrophe was to turn away. For example, when an orator is making a speech and he turns aside in the course of his speech to address someone briefly. You see that. I've done it in the Nehru Centre. I'm making a general speech to the audience, but I see the director sitting there and I say, Amish, as you and I have discussed the other day, which is called an apostrophe, apparently, in rhetoric. Okay. And then there is another usage of apostrophizing, which is when you address or appeal to somebody who is not present in your audience. Oh, Mahatma Gandhi, where are you now where we really need you? That is called apostrophizing. That's also an apostrophe. But unless you're given to very dramatic flourishes, neither of those forms need detain us. It's essentially about putting a mark for a number of very specific purposes. One is to indicate possession. Amish's Nehru Centre would give you an apostrophe S, though there are exceptions. For example, the word its. When you're talking about the Nehru Centre, you say its program, you do not put an apostrophe because English also has exceptions. Then you have the apostrophe do double duty in some words when you are wanting to stand for a possessive and an omitted letter, like when you say Jesus's disciples. You can write J-E-S-U-S apostrophe S, but most people leave out the extra S after the apostrophe, saying J-E-S-U-S apostrophe disciples is enough because it conveys, right? Then you've got apostrophes used in words like do's and don'ts. And there are people who would argue, as Lynn trusts the spelling guru, she argues for D-O apostrophe S, do's, and don'ts, D-O-N apostrophe T, and again apostrophe S in the phrase do's and don'ts. Well, hardly anyone does that, but that's what's going on. Then there is the apostrophe to leave out letters. So when you say, for example, don't, you are saying do not, and leave the apostrophe indicates the missing O, right? But when you say won't, will not doesn't have an O, so I mean, except for the O you're leaving out. So why do you say won't? Because it is actually a contraction of an archaic form of will, which was wall, W-O-L-L. And so the apostrophe replaces the LL in the old walnut, and therefore it stands for today's will not. So, I mean, it's almost better not to know all this. It's so confusing. And often, of course, people often follow a much simpler rule, which is only use apostrophes when not using them would obscure your meaning. Right. So, for example, if you're saying dot your I's and cross your T's, if you left out the apostrophe, it would become dot your is and cross your T's. Is a different word altogether. So you wouldn't do that. But apostrophes are very useful. One of my favorite stories of apostrophes comes from the British novelist Kingsley Amis, because he was challenged. Somebody challenged him to produce a sentence whose meaning depended on a possessive apostrophe. So he came up with 3 versions of the same sentence. Okay. Those things over there are my husband's. D apostrophe S, husbands. That means those things over there belong to my husband. Clear? Then he says, those things over there are my husband's, with the apostrophe after the S. That means that those things over there belong to several husbands of mine.
Correct.
Right? So much married Zaza Gabor, pointing out the artifacts in a living room, could say that.
I hope some of them were... Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
And then the third example he gave is if you leave out the apostrophe and just say, those things over there are my husbands, then the sentence means I'm married to those men over there. So you can imagine perhaps some rarely polyandrous queen would be able to say that. But the point he was making was very valid. Just placing an apostrophe or not placing it actually changes completely the meaning of the same sentence. That's the point of the apostrophe.
Fair point, fair point. And discovering that there was an archaic form of will called wall is that was a mind.
But you're living in England where you have so many problems with the Brits. For example, Harrods has dropped the apostrophe from its name, whereas Sainsbury's has not. Right? So the apostasy is going on right now. And look at one of my really the things that are most confusing is when Newcastle United play football at a stadium called St. James's Park, there's an apostrophe after James.
That's true.
When Exeter City plays at St. James's Park, there is no apostrophe.
Correct.
When London talks about St. James's Park, there is an apostrophe and an S after James.
Right.
Though it really is a park, whereas the other two are football stadiums.
Yeah, which is not too far from here.
So George Bernard Shaw wisely called the apostrophe uncouth bacilli. He didn't want anyone to use them. But anyway, apostrophe society has given up the ghost. So maybe eventually we'll all see apostrophes disappearing.
I'm still wondering who had the time to form that society. So clearly,
It had to be a retired journalist, not a working journalist.
All right. How about if we open the floor for questions from the audience?
Sure.
My team can start putting up the questions out here, and while those come up, how about if I ask you another word which is particularly relevant for us? There's a compliment for you. It's always an English class for us whenever Dr. Shashi Tharoor speaks.
Thank you. I'm not an English teacher, though, just a linguophile. I love my words.
How about this word, authorism?
Yeah, it's an interesting word. I mean, in fact, I debated in my mind whether to actually use it because it's a relatively recent coinage. It's what they call a neologism because it was invented as recently as the 21st century, around a decade or less than a decade ago, by the language scholar Paul Dixon, because he wanted to give a name to his book on words invented by authors. And he discovered there was no word for a word, phrase, or name created by an author which passes into common usage. So he came up with authorism. Now, what I realized from dipping into his work is that there are a heck of a lot of words which we take for granted that were actually invented by authors. In other words, authors writing a play or a novel or a book made up a word, and now we just, for example, William Shakespeare made up hundreds of authorisms. But they're words that are so ordinary and routine, you wonder how the world managed without them. Bump is a Shakespeare coinage. Hurry is a Shakespeare coinage. Critical is a Shakespeare coinage. So authorism was originally an archaic word fallen into disuse in the late 18th century, which meant the state of being a writer. So you and I, Amish, can be accused of authorism in the sense of having occupied ourselves with writing. That is our state. But the Dixon usage, which is actually a better usage, which says, let's find a word to apply to words that are invented by writers, that is fabulous. And I mentioned bump, but road is a Shakespeare authorism. Bedazzled is a Shakespeare authorism. And then, of course, there are so many famous phrases that Shakespeare came up with that are in common use today, like Brave New World, all's well that ends well, setting your teeth on edge, being cruel only to be kind. All of these, parting is such sweet sorrow. All this is Shakespeare. John Milton is probably second because a lot of his authorisms have survived into the present day. Earth-shaking. Earth-shaking is coined by John Milton. Lovelorn. And God knows, I've been there too often for my own good. Fragrance. By hook or by crook. Can you imagine? No one said by hook or by crook until Milton came up with it. But Milton also came up with words that no one uses. Ensanguined and horrent and so on that have died out since then. Sorry, go on.
Oh, no. What does horrent mean? I've never heard that word.
I think it was meant to be something worse than horrifying, and at the same time so profuse it was torrential or something. So, in any case, the word didn't survive, and you can't find it in any dictionary today. But I should say that Charles Dickens, as late as the 19th century, also came up with original words and phrases. Mark Twain introduced words into the American language from what he picked up along the Mississippi River. Words from the gold rushes of Nevada. For example, strike it rich is a Mark Twain authorism. Bonanza is another one. But then authorisms can also be to give new meanings to existing words. It was Mark Twain who turned hard-boiled into a synonym for tough in America. So in England, hard-boiled eggs you had, right? But they had no other meaning. It was Mark Twain who described a character as hard-boiled, meaning that he was tough. That sort of stuff. And I'm rather fond of a now completely forgotten writer called Sinclair Lewis, who was very big news in the 1920s and 30s in America. He is sort of one of the great inventors of failed authorisms. He invented words that never stuck, but I'll tell you some of them because they're so good. Rudyard Kipling, who, as you know, is one of my bugbears because of his imperialism and racism,
yeah.
right? For his bombastic prose, Sinclair Lewis coined the authorism Kiplingo. So if somebody said something racist, say, don't speak Kiplingo here. That kind of thing. Then in his time in America, there was a temperance movement that culminated in a law prohibiting alcohol, the prohibition thing. So many liberals like him thought that prohibition would fail. It was a bad idea, and you shouldn't impose your moral prejudices on people who didn't feel that way. So he called them teetotalitarians, which I thought was very clever. Teetotalitarians. And then in America, a lot of the philanthropic activities of the turn of the century and the early 20th century by people like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and so on. These were guys who had made their money in absolutely indecent ways and made a large fortune, and then almost to sort of improve their image and name, or also perhaps to appease their guilt, they set up libraries and museums and institutions and universities and so on. Sinclair Lewis called them philanthropers. That is, the robbers who are so we have perhaps a few philanthropers closer to home as well. That's the idea. But I'll probably shouldn't end authorism without really giving some credit to the most recent coiner of the most famous authorism. If you define an authorism as not just a word invented by an author, but one that's words that are in very common popular use, then I think the most recent one you'll have to give credit to is George Orwell. Because particularly in his novel 1984, he imparted chilling new meanings to commonly used words and combined ordinary words into sinister new phrases. Big Brother as a term to describe a totalitarian dictator. Double think. Newspeak, which seems to anticipate the post-truth and fake news of our times. So hats off to these authors for creating the words they did.
So Shivam Patel has a question for you. How do you memorize so many words?
I don't, Shivam. I just love reading. And when I read a lot of words, particularly, if you read the same word in 3 different books, in 3 different sentences, in 3 different contexts, you will not only understand the meaning of the word without needing to look up a dictionary. The word will stick in your mind because you've come across it in 3 places. And because you've seen the usage, you will be familiar with its nuances, whether it's a positive connotation and negative connotation, whether it's jocular, whether it's serious, just from reading. But if you have to read 3 books to get that word in 3 places, right? So my only advice to young people, I get questions all the time in high schools and colleges from kids saying, how do we improve our vocabulary? And my answer is always the same: read. The more you read, the better your chances of improving your vocabulary, simply because you'll read because you're interested in what you're reading, you'll be interested in the story or the subject, and then inevitably you'll come across words. And if you read with attention, those words will stick in your mind. I have very rarely looked up a dictionary, and I don't remember consulting a thesaurus except at university.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people will consult the Tharoorosaurus.
I'm sure Penguin hopes so.
Okay, so Yash Chandra
be a juggernaut, Amish.
Yash Chandan has a question. Tharoor sir, what were your favorite subjects in school besides English, of course?
Well, English was a subject, but I actually never studied it beyond school. For the simple reason, many thought that I would go and do English honors at college. But I said no, because for me to study English in a classroom was like learning about girls at medical school. You really, if you love something enough, then you have to discover it for yourself and learn its joys unmediated through an academic or scholarly process. So for that reason, I studied history, which was my other passion at school. And, it's interesting. A few months ago, an uncle of mine, who had often come and stayed with us when I was growing up, found in his basement or attic, I said Kerala must have been an attic, a notebook, an exercise book, going back to my class 10 in 1970 when I was 14 years old, which consisted of historical essays I had written for myself. It was not schoolwork. There were no teacher markings, no corrections. It was written beyond schoolwork with my own research and writing on modern Indian history, because I was so captivated by the subject. I spent my spare time reading and writing on subjects of history that interested me, whether or not they were being taught in the classroom. So that is the answer. I was a history nut, and to some degree, yes, an English nut. But I studied English all the way up to high school, and then said I will read for pleasure and not through the instruction of a teacher.
What did you graduate in?
History honors for my BA, Masters in International Affairs, Master of Arts in Law and Diplomacy, and PhD essentially in a subfield of political science in the international relations area.
Fascinating. Okay.
So
yeah, no, I loved history as a subject, but I didn't study it. I ended up studying mathematics. But I loved reading history, especially history non-fiction actually. So Yash Parekh has a question. I'd like to hear the longest word of the English language from Dr. Tharoor. And he does that with a namaste.
Well, the truth is, Yash, that I don't know how useful that is as an exercise. I mean, I think technically there is a longest word which is so long it takes up 36 pages of a dictionary, and it's totally irrelevant. No one uses it. There is another longest word, so-called, which was really made up because it's a very obscure illness that I think only 1 out of 100 million people have ever got, called pneumono-ultramicroscopic silicovolcanoconiosis. And that is not, again, a word you're going to use very often. Then you've got a word like floccinaucinihilipilification, which was invented in the 19th century, as I mentioned earlier, for the act of estimating something to be worthless. You have anti-disestablishmentarianism. And then there is a slightly jokey word which connotes a fear of long words, which very clearly you don't have, which is hippopotamonstrossesquipedaliophobia, which means a fear of long words. Don't suffer from
it. Okay, fascinating. There's Iram Akbar who has a question. Sir, what is the most difficult word you have come across?
No word is inherently difficult, Iram. It's either useful to you, that is a word that you may wish to actually employ, or it is irrelevant to you, in which case you forget it. So for somebody else, that may not be a different word because it may be relevant to him. But for you, it may actually be irrelevant, and therefore you may think of it as a difficult word. So I would argue there is nothing. I mean, I was actually giving some interviews about this book, and one journalist talked about how some of my words have become memes and so on, and then asked me about words later in the interview. And I said, listen, every word that I know and every word you know, at some point you encountered it for the first time. So you should not even think that it's a difficult word. It's a word you're meeting for the first time. You decide whether you want to shake hands and keep it with you alongside you as a friend, or whether you want to say goodbye and move on. Ultimately, that's the way you should look at words, in my personal view. And I pointed out to the interviewer that even the word meme was a word that I would not have known 2 years ago or 3 years ago, until its employment on the internet made meme a word that now is much more in common usage.
True. And meme is a word that has far greater understanding now as compared to even 10 years ago. Even in the mass space, it's interesting how it has changed. Sinu Raj,
only scholars used it before.
True. Very true. Sinu Raj has a question which you have actually answered already.
Just read.
Some tips to improve your vocabulary. Read. There are 2 authors out here whose books you could check out. Shameless Marketing. Iram Akbar, once again, what is your favorite pastime thing? Or in a Mumbai colloquial term, आपका time pass क्या है?
My time pass, apart from apart from reading, which is, I suppose, de facto my favorite time pass, when I can, which sadly is not often enough, I like watching cricket. So nowadays, what I try and do is, because I've become very conscientious about exercise, what I have tried to do now is to actually watch cricket highlights while exercising. So that's my favorite, but I'm not sure that counts as time pass.
Okay, I'm going to go back to one more word. I guess we have just a few minutes more of your time.
Okay.
Can you tell us about contronym?
Contronym. Now that's an interesting word because, of course, everyone knows about acronym. Everyone knows about synonym, and no one really seems to know what is a contronym. A contronym is a word that can also mean the opposite of itself. It's actually very common in English. It's not common in any Indian language. And the most common, popularly used word that's a contronym is the word sanction. Because, in fact, sanction is a contronym. When President Trump sanctions Iranian oil supplies, he's taking action against them. But when somebody sanctions your leave, they're giving you permission. It seems to be the opposite. So the fact is that in these situations, you may find a number of words in English, and perhaps only in English. I don't know enough other languages, but certainly the language of English creates a situation like this business of imposing sanctions and granting sanctions. And you find that in other cases. For example, the word off is probably the most common contronym, because setting off an alarm activates a warning bell. Switching off the alarm deactivates the warning bell. And both use the same off, right? Or take dust. You tell your maid that she needs to dust more, so there is less dust, because too many objects are gathering dust. So that's not just a contradiction; it's a contronym. Look at the word strike. Strike can be used to mean to create, as in let's strike a deal, or it can be used to mean to eliminate. Strike that from the record, And then if you say you have finished something, have you completed it or have you destroyed it?
It's I saw this brilliant ad on Tharoorosaurus that's been made by Penguin of your face on the My Name is Anthony Gonzalez song of Amitabh Bachchan. Yeah, so I thought that was lovely, and to use a term that Amitabh Bachchan himself used in one of his movies, English is a very funny language.
It is, and I must say it was fun doing that, because he has his own flair when he does what he does. Though, in all fairness, there's nothing about that character in Amar Akbar Anthony that actually makes him capable of those lines. So that's another issue
altogether. Dr. Tharoor, absolute pleasure hosting you. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. It was an absolute honor for us at Nehru Centre. All the very best for this new book to you. I'm sure it'll do fantastically well. And congratulations to Penguin for this launch. And to all of you watching this, the book Tharoorosaurus is available. It's available, of course, across India, but I've been told it's available in the UK as well. Do check out the online websites, Amazon. The book is available. Buy it, enjoy it, and have fun while reading it, and learn and grow.
Thank you, Amish, and namaste to you. One of the words in the book we didn't talk about, but the English language keeps growing, and we'll have to enjoy it as it grows. Thank you so much for this lovely event. Good to be back at the Nehru Centre, even virtually.
Pleasure. Bye, Dr. Tharoor. Bye.
Thanks, bye.
Namaste.
Reincarnation. India showed us what it's really about. India, it's so alive. Ayurveda had to be born here. Life flows through the air here, healing the body, reawakening the spirit. Ayurveda showed us you don't have to wait for reincarnation. You can be reborn in this life.
Incredible India.
Racing has taken me all over the world, but when I put on the helmet, I am still in India. India, where I found yoga.
Slow down, breathe.
I have breathed in India's magic. I have felt its warmth. Yoga has taught me the truth about life and motorcycles. That the more still you are, the further you can go.
Incredible India.
I was going to shut down my family bookstore, but the Indian rhinoceros saved it. In my travels through Kaziranga, I heard the story of the rhino.
50 years ago, there were only 400 rhinos. But now, there are more than 2,400.
India showed me what can happen if you don't give up. And if the Indian rhino can make a comeback, so can my bookstore.